Население Крыма всегда было пророссийски настроенным.
Crimean authorities, sensing the mood of the populace, fully supported Viktor Yanukovych's decision to postpone the 2013 European Union Association deal and side deeper ties to Russia. As the events in Kiev took their course, Crimean authorities issued a declaration, putting into words the fears of its people. Based on the will of the Crimeans who elected us, we declare that we will not give Crimea to extremists and neo-Nazis seeking to seize power in Ukraine at the cost of the blood of the country and its citizens. After the regime change in Kiev, rumors began spreading in Crimea that the new authorities would be merciless to those that oppose them.
Slava Ukraini!
This led to the pro-Russian demonstrations rejecting the new government in Kiev. On February 27th, the government buildings in the capital of Crimea were seized by pro-Russian protesters. The current Crimean government was dismissed, and the new leader, Sergei Aksyonov, was assigned as the leader of the Crimean Autonomous Republic.
У них, конечно, надежда была, и они обращались к российскому руководству, чтобы их защитили.
On March 16th, the Crimean referendum was held, and the people voted to leave Ukraine and enter the Russian Federation.
The situation in Crimea is being presented as a Russian invasion. And again, nobody who looks at this seriously and looks at the poll numbers, some of the poll numbers done by the US government agencies themselves, showing that the people of Crimea preferred being part of Russia. In the US news media, it has all been presented as the Russians invaded, they then staged a sham election, with people with guns at their backs. Somehow they faked the ballot boxes to get 96% approval for rejoining Russia.
The idea of a referendum in Crimea is just quite simply unconstitutional.
It does raise questions on whether this vote really is free and fair, especially given the heavy military presence in Crimea right now, Errol.
So that's how it's been sold to the American people. The reality is very different.
The atmosphere here certainly is electric. Thousands of people who've gathered in the capital Crimean city of Simferopol. All of this following a referendum held last Sunday in which the majority of people here overwhelmingly voted in support of being reunited with Russia.
Я бы хотел спросить, что такое демократия? Демократия – это политика, основанная на воле народа. Как выясняется воля народа? В современном мире с помощью голосования. Люди пришли свыше 90%, и свыше 90% проголосовали за присоединение к России. Нужно уважать выбор людей. Не подстраивать каждый раз под свои геополитические интересы, международное право и принципы демократии. У нас не было там никаких боевых действий. Там никто не стрелял. Никто никого не убивал.
What is described in the West as a Russian invasion of Crimea is, in fact, the presence of Russian soldiers in Crimea. Can you clarify that?
Российские солдаты в Крыму, как говорят, были испокон веков. Потому что база Черноморского флота была в Крыму.
As long ago as 1804, Sevastopol's naval base became the main military port of the Russian Empire on the Black Sea. During the Second World War, the heroic defense of Sevastopol lasted almost a year and took hundreds of thousands of lives. Therefore, the naval base in Crimea has a legacy of historical pride for the Russian Black Sea Fleet, as well as being of huge strategic importance.
Those of us alive back then remember when there were Soviet missiles put into Cuba, how frightened Americans were and how angry, and how we almost went to a nuclear confrontation over having weapons of that kind of destruction placed that close to the United States.
If the United States considers Cuba to be in its backyard, then Crimea lays at Russia's doorstep.
The consequences of a U.S. seizure of the base or a NATO base?
Очень тяжелые. потому что сама по себе база ничего не значит. Но вот чтобы я хотел отметить один нюанс. Почему мы так остро реагируем на расширение НАТО? Нас беспокоит практика принятия решений. Я знаю, как принимаются. Когда страна становится членом НАТО, ей уже очень трудно сопротивляться давлению со стороны такой крупной страны, лидера НАТО, как США. И там легко может появиться все, что угодно. Система противоракетной обороны, и новые базы, и, если потребуется, и новые ударные комплексы. А нам что делать? Мы должны в этой связи предпринимать контрмеры, то есть ставить под удар наших ракетных систем те объекты, которые, по нашему мнению, начинают нам угрожать. Ситуация напрягает.
If we are attacked, we would certainly respond.
Знаете, мне кажется, я не всегда понимаю логику наших партнеров. Иногда осталось впечатление, что нужно держать в повиновении и наладить дисциплину в своем собственном западном, так называемом, атлантическом лагере. Для этого нужен внешний враг. При всех опасениях Иран на это не очень тянет.
I am concerned about the expansion of NATO. NATO has expanded into 13 countries, up to the borders of Russia. 13 countries.
Эта тема очень опасная. Это тема войны. Вообще, война между Россией и Соединенными Штатами вообще это безумие.
In early spring of 2014, eastern Ukraine was also buzzing with protests against the new authorities in Kiev. This region, with the population close to Russia geographically and culturally, feared that the ultra-right leanings of the newly formed government would bring neo-nationalism to their lands. And they had their reasons. The status of the Russian language in Ukraine has been a stumbling block for many years.
Implementing Russian as a second state language was one of the main campaign promises of President Viktor Yanukovych.
In 2012, the Yanukovych government passed a law making it the second official language in the southern and eastern parts of Ukraine, the areas where the Russian-speaking population makes up a majority. Ukrainian nationalist groups initiated massive protests opposing the law. An observing viewer might see some familiar faces there. On February 23, 2014, the very next day after the regime change, the new government voted for an annulment of the official status of the Russian language. And even though later this decision was vetoed by the acting president, Alexander Turchinov, it still sent a message, and a powerful one. This alarmed the Russian-speaking cities of eastern Ukraine, and people took to the streets to show their disagreement. In response, pro-Maidan groups conducted their own demonstrations. When the two parties would meet, it was always tense, and eventually it led to tragedy. One person died and over 50 people were wounded in clashes during a pro-Russian march protesting the new government in Kiev. On April 6th, the Crimean scenario began repeating in eastern Ukraine, where protesters seized government buildings. And the next day, April 7th, they proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic. Kiev replied by announcing the beginning of an anti-terrorist operation in eastern Ukraine. By that time, the international media was screaming about a Russian invasion in Ukraine.
Russia could now be on the verge of invading Ukraine.
But strong words stayed only in the media. The Ukrainian authorities never announced a warlike situation. Why? IMF cannot give money to countries engaged in ongoing war. Petro Poroshenko.
Вы знаете, в большой политике, о чем бы ни говорили, все равно будут говорить о деньгах.
Too much money was already invested in Ukraine to stop halfway.
We've invested over $5 billion to assist Ukraine in these and other goals that will ensure a secure and prosperous and democratic Ukraine.
На развитие какой демократии тратились эти деньги? Как называли установление демократического режима? Я думаю, что это вот как раз тот режим, который сейчас насаждается на Донбассе.
Obviously, the funds had to keep coming, and the conflict had to keep going. getting more and more bloody and deadly.
Мы завалили все вместе.
As parties from both sides were using more sophisticated and lethal weapons.
Господин Турчинов, который фактически начал войну, он несет огромную ответственность за это. Он начал войну против собственного народа. Он послал войска в Донбасс. Они сделали то, чего не делал я. И они начали кровопролитие.
The world seemed too busy welcoming this new democracy in Kiev to notice what was being done as it spread its wings over the country. Many in southern Ukraine had been viewing the revolution with concern. And an anti-Maidan movement formed in the city of Odessa in early January 2014. The protesters set up their camp in front of the Trade Union House, a building which would soon become a monument to a massacre of its own. It's difficult to overestimate the importance of Odessa. It is strategically located on the Black Sea, and it's Ukraine's largest seaport. It's not surprising that Ukraine's new authorities were watching the situation unfolding there with growing alarm. More and more of Odessa's people were joining the anti-Maidan movement at the same time as events in eastern Ukraine were heating up. The new Ukrainian government didn't have the power to wage war on too many fronts. If Odessa were to join the growing uprising in the eastern regions, it would seriously complicate the situation. This rebellion had to be extinguished immediately and at any cost, and that cost was high. On May 2nd, 2014, soccer fans flocked to the center of Odessa city for the Ukrainian championship match. Surprisingly, a great number of these fans who descended into Odessa just the night before also turned out to be fighters from the Maidan self-defense units, along with members of radical organizations from all parts of Ukraine. These fans, masked, armed, and shouting nationalist mottos, began disturbances in the center of the city as they marched to the anti-Maidan tent encampment, where they attacked. The anti-Maidan protesters sought shelter in the Trade Union House, but it was a trap. Maidan supporters started throwing Molotov cocktails into the building until it was engulfed in flames. People burned to death inside, or, trying to escape, jumped from the windows. Although a fire station was less than a mile away, it took almost half an hour for firefighters to arrive. When they finally did, the damage had been done. But here's an intriguing fact. Just a few days before those dreadful events, a messenger from Maidan, Andriy Perubi, made a visit to Odessa. It's an interesting coincidence that some of the people he met with in Odessa were seen at the scene that fateful day. But not everyone was mourning. On the popular political talk show Schuster Live, the news about the people burnt alive in Odessa was welcomed with a long round of applause.
Із погибших в пожарі в Одесі 15 граждан Росії, 10 із Придністров'я і ні одного одесита.
On its Facebook page, the right sector announced the events of May 2nd, a proud moment in national history. An official investigation into this sad event has been going on now for nearly 2 years, and it's yet to reach a conclusion. But it seems the experts had all the information they needed from the very beginning.
Звичайно, провокація була з сторони путінських бойовиків, які почали розкол української демонстрації.
It looks like Odessa really is a very important piece of real estate, as it was honored with a very special new governor appointed on May 30th of 2015. Mikhail Saakashvili, an old friend of the United States and born and raised in Ukraine's neighboring country, Georgia.
A little hoedown there in Georgia.
A quick look at his biography gives one an understanding that he's been groomed for a special mission. Mr. Saakashvili received a U.S. State Department scholarship, and he worked for a New York law firm which represented the organization